On today's episode of the Old Souls Football Podcast, Neil and I introduce you to the American Football League, a league that only existed for maybe a decade, but had a lasting impact on pro football.
Before we get into our topic of conversation today, I do want to give, I'd be remiss if I didn't anyways. I want to give a shout out to one of our loyal listeners. I don't know how many of them there are, but
13,
my brother,
I believe.
13, yeah, 13 that keep coming back. We haven't lost them. Unfortunately, a lot of that 13 is close family and friends. But my brother Sean is a professional wrestler, like kind of WWE style. Well, it is WWE style, AEW style. But he does a lot of freelance stuff for different wrestling movements around the Chicago. Well, not even so much Chicagoland area. It's in Chicago, could be downstate. Illinois, could be up in Wisconsin, Indiana. Sean had a bad accident in the ring on Saturday night. He broke his femur in 3 pieces. So Sean took a tough injury, but Sean's a tough kid, and I know he's going to be listening to this podcast in his recovery, and hopefully he's thinking of a nice old parlay, maybe a Bears first place, Packers last place finish. That'll pay out maybe 10,000 to 1.
Sean was definitely tough enough to play in the AFL.
He was. And actually, that's what we're talking about today. The American Football League, not the Aussie Rules Football League, if we have anybody abroad listening to this. The AFL was, at the time, like many leagues that tried to contest with the NFL. And at the time, a lot of people thought, well, this one will fail too. So let's bring you back to set the scene for you. Late 1950s America, we'll say like 1958, 1959, around there. This is, of course, the height of the post-war boom. Obviously, the U.S. family is growing more than ever. Families wanted to have more children because it was the idea. There was an idea that this country had survived 2 world wars, and they were going to bring a bunch of children into a world of freedom and prosperity.
It was time to prosper for all the labor and the suffering that we went through as a country and as a world during, both World War I and World War II. You had a Great Depression. America finally gets basically placed as the number one superpower in the world, economic, military. So really, like, they're enjoying kind of the fruits of their labor by the late 50s. And that's, like you said, that's why you get all that economic development.
And more than ever, like so many different empires had their own peak as the world's top dog, number 1 in the AP poll. But America picked a great time to peak themselves, because this was about when the world was starting to become even more connected than ever. Television brought the world closer to each other. And because Americans had so much more money to spend, they had more time for leisure, and leisure included things like watching TV and watching sports on TV. The NFL, as we mentioned in the Lombardi podcast, they were just at their kind of what's the word I want to say, like their breakout moment in 1958 during the NFL championship game, when the Baltimore Colts beat the Giants in sudden death overtime.
That was the first time a lot of Americans had tuned in to watch pro football. Prior to that, pro football was kind of seen as like the lesser in terms of popularity, reputation wise. Like college football was number 1 in terms of football, and then like Major League Baseball was by far and away like America's pastime, yet boxing. So like during World War II, when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, one of the first conversations actually Roosevelt had internally with a lot of his cabinet, and then he reached out to the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and they had a discussion on whether it was appropriate to have baseball during a world war where you're sending young men into war to prevent the spread of the Nazis and of course the war in the Pacific as well. You have all of that going on, and the NFL and pro football was not even in that discussion.
Yeah,
Roosevelt said it was
they were an
important.
afterthought.
Roosevelt believed, and I think he was right, that it was important for morale for the country to have baseball because that was a part of its culture. But we're not at the point, like the National Football League and really pro football in general was not a part of that conversation. So in the 40s, like the NFL was kind of not, I wouldn't say a joke, but it had a lot of transition. Like you had the Eagles and the Steelers during the war were actually the Steagles.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the Steelers, I think, or the Eagles, I think, combined teams again with somebody else. I think like
The
it was
Chicago Cardinals.
yeah, they were the what was their nickname? It was Cardinals and the car, or I can't remember, but
Yeah, I can't remember it either.
yeah.
Damn.
But anyway, the NFL really built its reputation once TV comes along. So in the 40s, people don't have radios in their houses. Come 1950s, people are starting to have televisions. Number one, because like you said, they have more money. America is making things. We can't even say that now. We get buy half
Mm-hmm.
of our crap from China. Like America was creating wealth and it was prospering. So, like you said, people had more time for leisure. They were buying television sets really for the first time. And the NFL, as we know, is the perfect product for television. I work for a TV station. Our number one product that we sell in terms of ratings or cost per thousand, or not cost per thousand, but viewership is pro football and college football. So when you combine that and then a great championship game, like you say, in 1958, it's like a revolution. I think that's the moment pro football becomes the number one sport in America, is when the Colts beat the Giants in overtime.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people like started to realize that baseball kind of sucked watching on TV. Like me and you have talked about this before. A great sport to have on as background noise, but I think Americans were starting to be like, eh. Well, I mean, boxing was so big on TV, but football really hit it.
Well, yeah, the
Well,
way you followed baseball was you followed box scores in the newspaper, or you like just
right.
had it on in the background when you're, on the
On the
radio.
radio. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Uh,
for TV, it's, football is more of a combat style sport. There's two sides,
yes.
there's a lot of moving pieces, there's a lot of action, and there's not a lot of games. So it's just there's this combination. There's a lot of drama. It really I like there's not been a product better for television than football,
No,
at least not
really, there
yet.
hasn't.
Since television came a thing, like we said in the late 50s.
Watching this game along with 45 other million Americans was Lamar Hunt, who is a name that was not known so much at the time, but now we all know very well. He was the son of an oil tycoon, H.L. Hunt. And Lamar Hunt himself was, of course, he had the backing of money, but he was into football. He played at Southern Methodist, which I kind of was wondering, was he one of the guys that would have been donating money during the Pony Express time? I bet
Oh,
he was.
100%.
Yeah.
I
Um,
mean, you have to think though with
there was a
college
lot of
football,
guys like that in Dallas too,
well,
though.
college football in Texas and generally in the South, I think it happens anywhere where you
Oh
have
yeah.
competitive people. I mean,
And
you're gonna
wealthy
do it.
owners or wealthy
Yeah,
benefactors, I should say.
they got to put they are gonna put their pride, which is their college. They're gonna put that before even their investments a lot of the times, and they're gonna throw money at players, and that's what happened
Absolutely.
in Texas or in Texas for sure.
But even as a 22-year-old young college graduate, Hunt realized that he wanted to get in on this new growing league. Well, it wasn't new, but it was certainly a growing league. They had the opportunity. The NFL had kind of made it known that the Chicago Cardinals could be up for sale, at least shares of them. What Hunt wanted to do was bring the Cardinals to Dallas, and the owners were vehemently against this idea. Why? George Halas said something along the lines that um, it's silly to think of now, but he didn't feel like that the NFL should be growing past the areas it was already in, which doesn't make like because you can't grow if you don't venture out.
Yeah.
But
I
silly,
yeah. It George Halas, football visionary. He was there at Ralph Hayes's dealership in Canton,
hmm
Ohio when they founded the league. Like you can't say that George Halas was a stupid man. Obviously, that would not be correct. Football visionary, was a good coach, great coach,
yeah,
and I mean, he's one of the faces of the NFL in its history. So this is no disrespect, but I was amazed at the lack of foresight
yeah,
that he had. So really, he created by being cheap, basically, because
yeah,
the reason he wanted to, I think the main reason he wanted the NFL to stay as a Midwestern slash Northern sport
yeah.
was essentially to keep travel costs down,
That
which was
that
really
was
stupid.
that was the other part of it too. I think it was a northern thing. They didn't want it to spread below the Mason-Dixie line. I think that was part of it. Even
I
though
think,
that never came up, that was just a theory I had.
yeah, maybe. I mean, I ultimately, I mean, George Preston Marshall of the Redskins, his big thing is he didn't want any competition because he owned the entire Southeast.
He was kind
So,
of an asshole.
oh yeah, well, giant racist, and we can get it.
Yeah,
We can spend a whole episode talking about him. But like with George Preston Marshall and the Redskins, he kind of had really kind of what the Braves have now in baseball, where an entire region didn't have an NFL team. So like when my
mm,
dad was growing up, he was a Colts fan. My grandfather was a Packers fan. Uh, one of my uncles was like a Rams fan because you didn't have a team. There are a ton of
yeah,
people around here that are still Redskins fans because they grew up and they didn't even have the Falcons yet because it was might have been the early 60s at that point. So
hmm
the whole point is they had this region locked up. So I think that was more of his angle. I honestly think Hallis's main issue was he didn't want to pay for a plane ticket to
yeah,
Dallas, which was crazy because and the thing is he was one of the owners that back when I guess it was it Dan Reeves, the original owner of the Rams,
yes,
he wanted to move the team from Cleveland, which
hmm
he ended up doing successfully. He moved they were the Cleveland Rams, became the Los Angeles Rams. He was a visionary because he understood the league and his team grow immensely in value because you expand it and you make it a true national sport because like the
yes,
NFL was more than basically the state of Ohio, Illinois,
Pennsylvania.
Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Like
hmm
that's really what it was, and it's more than that. And then like they weren't even in Minnesota. It kind of started that way because you had like little towns like Duluth when they first started. But
hmm
it amazed me that, and I think Hallis like immediately regretted this because what he did was for being, and he was known to be a kind of a penny pincher.
Oh
Like
yeah. As
I
Mike
mean, Mike,
Ditka said, he threw nickels around like manhole covers.
yeah. So he was always big on keeping player salaries down. But the thing is, like, it's a lesson when you're overly cheap. Sometimes you can't see the forest from the trees. And what Mike
True.
Ditka did, or not Mike Ditka, George Hallis, what he did was he ended up creating a bigger problem for the NFL because Lamar Hunt had plenty of money, and some of his
Yeah.
business partners did too, and they might just go and create their own thing.
Yeah, and that's what they ended up having to do. The owners did offer Lamar Hunt a 49% share of the Cardinals, but of course they weren't going to allow him to move. So it really wasn't worth it then. He wanted majority share and he wanted to take the team to Dallas. So he got stiffed. essentially, and by the old boys club, you might say. And on the plane ride back to Dallas, I believe Bert Bell, who was the commissioner at the time of the NFL, very shortly there, because he didn't live much longer after all this.
Yeah.
Um, but Bert Bell had told him, he goes, well, yeah, there's other guys out there that want to create or get into the NFL. There's Bud Adams and there's Harry Wiseman, and on the plane back, Lamar Hunt said, well, why don't I just call those guys up and we start our own league? And that's exactly what he did on the airplane. He came up with the skeleton of the league, where he was talking about things like shared revenue that the NFL hadn't even introduced yet. He was talking about how they were going to use scheduling. He was talking about where he wanted to focus on acquiring players. He had already the names down of the people that he wanted to call to see if they were interested. It was
Yeah.
really interesting.
Do you think like the best ideas really come from like two places? Like he came up with the modern NFL when he was on a plane, maybe eating some peanuts, drinking some ginger ale.
Yeah.
You know, pretty stewardess is walking by. It's either that or you're on the toilet. So I was
It's
like,
true.
he could have been lying. I like to think that the NFL was created while Lamar Hunt was on the toilet.
Well,
That's
that's
just my
actually what
theory.
we're gonna go with.
Was the and my like the other question? You're a huge Bears fan. Was the 46 defense? Did Buddy Ryan come up with that on the toilet?
It probably did that,
Yeah,
or like, on the
you
back
could.
porch. Like another great place is the back porch when you're having a beer by yourself,
Yeah,
not with anybody. But yeah, he was probably like, oh, I could just move Doug Plank to linebacker and
yeah,
call it the 46.
yeah. You
Um,
think like Bill Belichick drafted Tom Brady like after cutting the grass and having a cold one? Like that's like where I get my epiphanies from, like the smell of gasoline and fresh cut grass.
yeah,
Like, but
you,
it really like yeah, I agree like with you. He came up basically with what we see today, and the biggest thing that I saw, and it's like the first thing a lot of people will say like it's anti-capitalist because they'll say like
yes,
revenue sharing, but revenue sharing is why the NFL is so successful.
yeah,
It's what allows Jacksonville or Green Bay or New Orleans to
hmm
be just as
Miami,
they have every chance of being successful just like the Los Angeles Rams do, the New York Giants, the Dallas Cowboys, like these bigger market teams. That's what makes the NFL, and that's what made it surpass baseball, in my opinion, is you
yes,
have these teams. And the NFL, like you said, was, they were close to getting there because they
yeah, they were
recognized that,
about 2 years away.
yeah, and they needed a league-wide TV deal. And the only way to really come up with a fair deal is you have to split the money evenly. And they came, so that's Lamar Hunt's best idea is, and that's what makes the NFL is so strong because Jacksonville can be your weakest link. But the thing is, like Jacksonville's not weak. Jacksonville's a completely stable franchise, even though they could be
Hmm.
poorly run and lose a bunch of games. Jacksonville has no chance of like folding, and that keeps everybody. It's just a strong core, and he kind of created that.
Yeah, he did. One of the things that Hunt wrote down on his notepad is that he felt that that his new league needed a cornerstone rivalry. Meaning, when he looked at the NFL, he knew that on the East Coast, you had Giants and Redskins or Giants and Eagles.
Yeah,
Well, the Eagles weren't good, but you at least had Eagles, Steelers in Pennsylvania. In the Midwest, you had Bears, Packers. So he felt like if he wanted to make this league work, he needed to draw everybody's attention to, you got to watch this game. These two teams hate each other. So who did he call up? The guy that Burt Bell told him about, Bud Adams. Bud Adams, who was from Houston, also an oil tycoon of his own. He was the owner of the Astros. Was he? I don't know if with the Astros, or did he become the owner of the Astros? I know he was the owner of the Astros. I feel like they didn't come till like 1960 though.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit later, but I mean
Yeah.
the key theme with the AFL guys and the reason they really succeeded is they had more money.
Yeah.
They could survive.
Yes.
And people like Hallis, for example, his wealth came from owning the Bears and an
Yes.
asset that appreciated over time. The Bears were worth nothing basically when he acquired them from, I guess it was originally like a work team that he
Yeah.
got from the state. Was it the
AE.
Staley?
Yeah. AE Staley.
Yeah. So it was basically like a workers team that he
Hmm.
inherited, that he basically took control of and created an NFL team with. And over time his wealth grew, but a lot of people still don't understand, like, it's a huge advantage for your team to be owned by, you know a David Tepper or somebody that comes in and has more cash than anyone, right? That if he wants to go and give somebody $200 million guaranteed, he could do it. He can write a check for it right now, like, because he
Yeah.
he has the
Easily.
cash on hand. The Hallis family, I guess they're the McCaskies now. They can't do that. Like,
No.
they can't. They don't have the ability to just find $200 million. Yes, their franchise might be worth,
It's all
five
liquid.
bit 5 billion, but they'd have to start selling, and they don't want to
Hmm.
do that. So that's the advantage Bud Adams had. So if you get in, and same with Lamar Hunt, they could get into bidding wars for players,
Yeah.
and they have more cash. They can just, like, hey, Mike Ditka, and I mean foreshadowing here. Hey, Mike Ditka, superstar for the Bears. You want to come to Houston?
Yeah.
I have more cash than the old man up there, and he could make that happen. That's why, to me, it was so important for Hunt to get some of these other business people in, because they could call the NFL's bluff with the
Yeah.
amount of money that they had.
So Hunt called up Bud Adams and he invited him out to lunch, or I think he met him out to lunch in Houston.
Yeah,
So the conversation wasn't like he didn't say like I'm you know let's start this new league, let's go to lunch and talk about it. They met as two business people, obviously two guys that had a commonality of they were trying to get into the NFL, and Hunt very kind of slowly brought it up like he was like, yeah, kind of I have this idea, and like just drew in Bud Adams closer. And finally he posed the big question. He got down on a knee.
yes. Every kiss begins with K.
Every kiss begins with Lamar. um, and he said, I want to start this new league. I want to compete against the NFL, and I want to bring football to Texas. And that was the thing that sold Bud Adams is I want to bring football to Texas because he wanted to bring the Cardinals to Houston as well.
Yeah.
And so then it was off. They went back into the limousine, and I think that's where Adam started to get the idea that oh, he's already got like this kind of like this wasn't like a spur of the moment thing. Like kind of like when we came up with the idea for the podcast, we both had it in the back of our minds for years, and it was just like when we finally kind of rolled all the ideas together, we're like, well, let's just do it. I think that's kind of how that went. Lamar Hunt went out on the recruiting trail trying to find guys like him and Bud Adams. Bob Housem from Denver was somebody he called. Bob Housem was the son-in-law of Senator Edwin Johnson in Colorado, and he was the owner of a minor league baseball team. Not incredible money, but he had a stadium. He called up Max Winter from Minneapolis. Max Winter was the former owner of the Lakers, and he actually tried bringing the Cardinals to Minnesota.
Everybody wants the Cardinals, and what's so funny about this is the Bidwells owned the Cardinals during this
Yes.
whole thing, right? They
I think
still own them.
the old man died, I think, and they were like kind of wondering if they wanted out or not. I think that
Yeah,
was how it
yeah.
went, but it's funny,
But
yeah, like
it,
it was like it'd be like putting your house in the market and then like 50 years later be like, "Yeah, we decided to keep it."
Yeah, I mean, like most teams have been sold multiple times since
Yeah.
this has happened. The Bidwells are like one of the last legacy ownerships left of like, I mean, not from the beginning. They're not like necessarily the Rooneys or anything, but like, or the, the McCaskies, but they've been around for 70 years basically. And they're the ones that they didn't really want any part of the Cardinals. They wanted to sell them,
Yeah.
and they ended up they ended up keeping him for a while. It's just kind of ironic.
It is. Another name he called up was, and actually these two of these next couple names, they might sound familiar. He called up William Shea from New York. Shea from New York. Does that ring a
Yeah.
bell?
Yes, Shea Stadium.
Shea Stadium. He was the owner of the football Yankees, not the New York baseball Yankees. The football Yankees played in the AAFC, the American
Yeah. They were the one
Association.
they were one of the franchises that did not make it to the NFL. So
Yes.
the
Like the Browns and the
49ers,
49ers. I think
yeah.
just those two, right?
Yeah, just those two were able to make it into the NFLs. Those were the only ones. So like you mentioned, Shea owned an NFL team, wanted or AAFC team, but wanted in on the NFL, but that didn't really happen.
Yeah. And so he told him, he goes, why don't you call up Harry Weismer? And Harry Weismer was interested. And then another name that you might recognize, Baron Hilton.
Yeah, the hotel
Hilton,
magnet, right?
yeah, the hotel magnate. And
Yep.
he was out in Los Angeles. So Hunt played this perfectly. He had guys ready, and actually, he had perfect leverage. He called up Burt Bell and he gave him one last chance. And he said, what do you think? Expansion team, me and Bud Adams to like you gave us two expansion teams in Texas. And Bell adamantly refused because again, they weren't a part of the old boys club.
Yeah.
And this was like the moment that it set it in stone. Hunt was almost happy. He was like, okay, now you asked for it.
Yeah. What's kind of funny though, so I don't know if you actually heard the story because this is in the book 10 Gallon War, which is like a book about the Cowboys and the Chiefs. So apparently, even after Bell, I think, rejects their initial proposal, Hunt ends up saying, "Hey, I'm gonna create the AFL with my business partners." George Hallis actually calls him, or like
Oh no.
from they bring him to Chicago, or they bring Hunt, they bring Howsam, and they bring Bud Adams. Those three, because those are really they was I guess those three were like the main three,
Mm-hmm.
especially Adams and Hunt. So those three go up to Chicago and meet at Hallis's sporting goods store. And Hallis originally was one of the very old school, like the old boys club, did not want these guys in the league. But I think when he realized that they have all of these business partners that they could actually create a legitimate league with a lot of money, he changed his tune. So suddenly, like, he was friendly and he said, we're going to give Bud Adams, we're going to give Lamar Hunt, we're going to give y'all new franchises in the NFL. You're going to have your team in Dallas. Bud Adams is going to have his team in Houston, and they were going to give Howsam a large share of an existing team that he could
Hmm.
probably eventually turn into full ownership if he wanted. So Hallis, I think, realized crap. Like,
Yeah.
so I think he admitted, oh, we might have made a mistake. We might have fucked up here, guys.
Yeah.
And instead, to Hunt's credit, they say no. They're sticking with their business partners. And now I
Yeah.
kind of look back, I'm like, I don't think I would have said no. I'd have said
No,
like,
that's quite a gamble.
I would have been like, Harry Wismer, you're a great guy, but
You got season tickets. I
yeah,
promise you.
I'm gonna get like I'm getting what I wanted, and I'm getting, an NFL team in the state of Texas. And all that took was, and I think they considered it, but they ended up saying, it's the right thing to do. We can't do wrong by our business partners. And I respect that. But think about that decision for a second.
Oh man.
The AFL that doesn't exist. The Kansas City Chiefs don't exist because there's no other team in Dallas to push out the Texans. Uh, you know, does the NFL even expand like the way it did? I mean, there's no Oakland Raiders, there's no Chargers, like there's just, there's no Super Bowl. Like
No,
there's so many things just from one like little business meeting in a sporting goods store in Chicago. It's nuts like how this stuff worked
butterfly
back then.
effect.
Yeah. But that's a little story from that book that I thought
Okay.
was really interesting.
Yeah, that is. I didn't know that part.
Yep.
Um, Bert Bell in 1959, then, I think around the summer or maybe early fall. It definitely wasn't late fall because he died in late fall. He had to go before a Senate anti-monopoly subcommittee because there was a supposed monopoly. The NFL had a supposed monopoly on pro football, and it kind of did. Like, they squeezed the life out of these other leagues. And so Bert Bell called up Lamar Hunt and said, like, well, you're starting your own league, right? And Lamar Hunt was like, no, because this wasn't public knowledge at this time. And Lamar Hunt was like, yeah, I am. Well, we're in the works of it. So Bert Bell went in front of the Senate subcommittee and said, well, actually, no, we don't have a monopoly because Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams are starting their own league. And
Yeah,
Lamar Hunt said,
thank God we have competition. Ooh. And like
look,
a year before that, they were like, we don't want any competition.
yeah, we don't want it. Lamar Hunt said that was better than me announcing it because everybody would have been like, who's Lamar Hunt?
Yeah.
And he was like, I let Burt Bell do the talking for me. So
Imagine Roger Goodell saying like, "Hey, The Rock is starting the USFL or whatever it's called, the UFL, or they change names every year." But that's like essentially Roger Goodell at the Super Bowl announcing, "Hey, there's a different league out there, guys. Just letting y'all know."
how come that hasn't happened again? I wonder.
In terms of like the
Like, how come?
NFL.
Yeah, like the U.S. Well, yeah.
Oh,
How
well,
come
because
that never?
there's antitrust, like, so the NFL has like an antitrust agreement.
Oh,
That's part of their broadcasting deal. Where basically like for example, like they have to play on Sundays. They you can't have an NFL game on a Saturday because that conflicts with college.
okay.
Um, and I think it allows them to negotiate as a league for their TV rights. Because technically, like, you have all these different organizations that compete against each other
Yeah,
are technically sharing revenue, which that doesn't necessarily exist in
yeah.
common business.
They're
Pro
they're not
pro
separate
sports
entities.
pro sports are not, outside of baseball, do not operate like the rest of American economics because
No.
for the good of competition, like as consumers, we want competition. We don't like Amazon can go out and destroy small businesses and that's fine because that's, some people will disagree with that, but like that they have the buying power, that's capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for the sake of American culture with sports, we don't necessarily root for that. Unfortunately, we don't. I think we ought to look at supporting small businesses and
Yes,
letting smaller entrepreneurs succeed. But this is America. That's not what we do. We care about football teams,
we
and
sure do.
yeah. So, but anyway, like there's some antitrust exemptions that the NFL gets,
I
and a
see.
lot of this came around this time period because the Congress was looking at how this, like, wait a second, like there's only one football league and they're not letting it expand.
Yeah, and they're
And
swallowing up all other
yeah,
leagues.
yeah, and the biggest concern that this always has brought, and there's a reason why there's an antitrust exemption that they work in, and the players have to collectively bargain, for example, is because if there's only one dominant league and you're a professional football player, you're only negotiating with
Yeah,
one league. Like you can't go to the AFL
and
and
bargain.
bargain for your services, like, or come back and ask for a raise. And this was before there's free agency and all these other things. And the
Yeah.
union had a lot less power back then. So kind of getting in the weeds here, but that's how it kind of works now compared to the way it works back then. That's why, and I mean, they still get called before Congress, I feel like every 10, 15 years. So,
No, that adds context. That's good. So anyways, the beans were out now. Like Burt Bella spilled the beans, and he did it to help his own cause. But in doing so, he's also helped the AFL. So the AFL starts to form its initial group. Its initial group that we call or now know as the Foolish Club. The Foolish Club was Lamar Hunt, and his team was the Dallas Texans. Bud Adams had the Houston Oilers. Baron Hilton had the Los Angeles Chargers. Um, Harry Weismer had the New York Titans. Bob Housem had the Denver Broncos. Those are the guys I already introduced. And then they called up a few other guys. Ralph Wilson, who was originally a minority owner of the Detroit Lions, he moved to Buffalo and took over the Bills.
yep.
And actually the Bills' early uniforms didn't have any red in them. They
They were
resembled the
Detroit Lions
Lions.
yeah, they were Lion
Yeah,
lookalikes
they
essentially.
were the
Yeah.
Lions on the other side of Lake Erie.
It was like when Paul Brown started the Bengals, which
Yes,
we'll get to the next episode of the AFL, but they were basically the lookalike of the Browns. They were the same
right.
thing. Yeah.
And then Billy Sullivan, who was a former sports writer and publicity director at Boston College, he took over the Boston Patriots. Billy Sullivan and his kids ran into a lot of financial issues around the 80s. And actually, that's how Bob Kraft took over
Yeah.
um, the Patriots.
A
And
lot of these franchises, there's one last one I'll go into it.
yeah, so and then there were eight technically owners of the Oakland Raiders. Most famously, there was F. Wayne Valley. Now, I mentioned earlier a name that um, did not get an AFL team, and that was Max Winter. Max Winter was from Minneapolis, if you remember.
Yeah.
There's a funny story about that. Of course, Bud Adams and Lamar Hunt didn't get their two NFL teams, but Max Winter did. Max Winter got
Vikings.
the Minnesota Vikings. And there was one other
Oh,
the
and
Cowboys.
they
Yeah.
yeah, they started the Cowboys. And
Yeah.
that was basically that was the
A
NFL
middle
giving the middle
finger.
finger to the AFL, and it's specifically Lamar Hunt because it's like we know your team is in Dallas, and that's where you want your team to play. We're gonna
Hmm.
bring our league, which was better, to the NFL or to Dallas. They're gonna bring the NFL to Dallas and play in the same stadium and compete for the same players,
Yeah,
compete for the same fans, do the same promotions. It was just a giant middle finger, and
it
you can really
was.
you can probably thank George Halas probably more than anybody for the creation of the Cowboys. Because I think,
Wow.
well, yeah, I mean, 'cause Halas was the big guy. Like,
George
eh,
Halas has helped so
yeah,
many other teams win Super Bowls,
yeah.
except
So the Packers have won 4 Super Bowls. The Cowboys have won 5. I'm
five.
sure he did the 49ers a favor in the 70s. I mean, he
Yeah.
he probably told the 49ers, "Hey, you should go hire Bill Walsh." Like
Yeah. That guy's pretty good. And the
he
Bears
told
won
the
one.
he told the Packers to go get Lombardi.
Oh,
So
nice.
yeah, and I'm trying to
I
think. There was no 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 no. He told he he told he did tell the Cowboys when they were started that you should go get Textram. Like he literally just helps these teams. Like it amazed me. It's like, and to his credit, he was a visionary because he understood where the Packers were in the 50s, where the Cowboys were starting out in the 60s. These teams had to succeed for the good of the league. And
yeah.
I think he cared just as much about the health of the NFL as he did the health of the Chicago Bears, which back then they were still dominating. So I don't think it necessarily felt like he didn't feel like he was necessarily sacrificing, but
Yeah.
I'll give him credit for that he did see a little bit. I think after he made the mistake of letting the AFL kind of begin, I think he understood
changed
like
his ways a little bit.
yeah, and I think he helped kind of keep the NFL ahead of the AFL for the few years that it needed to. Um, going to the like there's two teams specifically. You mentioned the ownership groups, and they were just clusterfucks. So the Raiders and the Titans were just like
Oh
the
yeah,
biggest. Like I just amazing how they even lasted more than one season. To be honest with
yeah,
you, um, the Raiders especially. So we'll get into Wismer in a second with the Titans, which become the Jets. Uh, but it's actually kind of amazing they survive, and it makes me just respect Al Davis even more because like they have all these different owners. There's just complete chaos, and that chaos actually lasted up until 2005. I didn't realize this, but Al Davis wasn't the majority owner of the Oakland Raiders, the Los Angeles Raiders, until 2005.
really.
Yeah, he was not the majority owner. He had control under California state law because they had signed some backroom deal. They had him as the basically the operator, the owner slash operator of the franchise, but he did not have a majority stake in the Raiders. And like he got sued, but like he kept them out. Al Davis, like he is a Raider. Oh my God. Like he
Oh
basically took
yeah,
that team. And eventually now the Davis is, or I guess it's what's his son's name? I'm
Mark.
blanking. Mark Davis, basically he owns the Raiders now. But
Yeah,
like when
he
they were
has
winning
some of
all the
the
Super,
least amount of cash flow though in the
yeah.
NFL, I
Well,
think.
because he's a legacy owner. Like he was his dad was just a football coach. It wasn't like he wasn't an oil tycoon or anything. But
Right.
that shows you like of course there were Lamar Hunts and Bud Adams. They had all the oil money. Like specifically Lamar Hunt's dad made a joke to the press that, you know, Lamar's team will fold when he runs out of cash in 100 years. Like he could literally operate the Texans slash Chiefs for a century,
Yeah.
or he'd probably go under.
And he didn't foresee them getting Patrick Mahomes
No.
either.
So it's worked out very nicely for Hunt, but not everybody was in that situation. Like the Raiders and specifically the Titans slash Jets, and you'll get to them in a second. It's amazing that this league lasted the first 2 years. Like it's kind of a miracle that it held on, to be honest,
It
because
it
like
did. Yeah.
yeah, these ownership groups outside of like the main first two, like a lot of chaos, and some of the venues they played in were just like, oh
Oh,
god,
turnover. Oh
they
my
were high
God.
school stadiums,
Yeah,
like
they
that
were.
or
Yes,
yeah,
that's what Houston played in.
yeah. So, but they were foolish, and
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I was letting you go.
So, yeah, and then yeah, it really came to fruition, and we'll talk more about 1962 in a little bit, but 1962 was really when the roost came to roast for these two clubs. The Raiders were not to jump the gun, but we like otherwise we wouldn't talk about the Raiders and the Titans
Yeah,
because they literally had nothing to write home about. The Raiders had won 3 games. Their first year in 1960 they were all right. I think they were on 500. But in 61 and 62 they won 3 total games. And in 62 they won the last game of the season. Like they almost went winless.
yeah.
And the AFL owners kind of stepped in, and it was almost like a coup d'etat, and they were just like, yeah, we Al Davis over there, in I think he was in Los Angeles. I think he was with the Chargers.
It was the
Uh,
Chargers. Yeah,
yeah, like you need to go take this thing over, and he did, and it was the only thing that saved them. The Titans, um, we just skip ahead real quick to where I talked about them. They they played in the Polo Grounds, and as storied of a venue as the Polo Grounds were, by 1960, it was not really a famed ballpark anymore.
no,
Of course, the Dodgers were already gone at that point. Um, so uh, they were drawing like the first 2 years they did okay in terms of, I mean, none of the teams did great in terms of drawing attendance, but in 1962 they drew 100,000 people all season. Like,
So
that's
that's about 3,000 fans per game.
yeah. I mean, they
So
did horrible. Harry Wismer had the fans sit in both end zones so that
yeah,
when the TV camera, like when a team would score a touchdown, it would look like that there's fans in the ballpark, but those are the only fans that were there.
yeah.
And
Meanwhile,
eventually,
and I guess across the Hudson, I don't think it's the Hudson, but basically over in the Bronx,
yes.
the Giants are drawing 80,000 people.
And see, that was the problem. Like they were going up against the Giants, who were a stalwart of the NFL. And even the Raiders were going up against the 49ers, who had a good backing themselves. Because
Yeah.
they had just won a championship maybe 3 or 4 years before the Raiders even took over. But so anyways, let's get into we're going to talk about the first 3 seasons of the AFL. 1960, 61, and 62. 1960, Joe Foss was picked as the commissioner of the AFL. Um, there wasn't a whole lot about Joe Foss out there, other than that he was also somebody that shared the idea or Hunt's vision of shared revenue.
I
And he was a
almost,
really charismatic, good looking
yeah,
guy.
I kind of look at him as Lamar Hunt's like puppet,
Yeah, I
where,
think really that's all he
yeah,
was.
Lamar Hunt was the de facto commissioner, and you'll see that when we get to the merger in a couple of episodes. But like, and I mean that technically is the job of a commissioner, is you basically are the talking head on behalf of the ownership group, and Lamar Hunt represented the ownership group for the most part.
Yes. Um, the AFL lands their first big star. I mean, talk about a splash right away.
This saved the league, in my opinion.
It did. I mean, thank God they did this. They got Heisman Trophy Award winner Billy Cannon. A new league took the most exciting, the best player from college that year. Um, but it wasn't easy. There was a huge contract dispute with the LA Rams because Billy Cannon was drafted number 1 overall in the NFL draft, but the NFL kind of held their draft in secrecy. They didn't tell anybody that they were holding the draft. So there was really like there was no publicity, and like I don't think um uh they actually had to go to court. The Houston Oilers had to go to court. I forgot to mention that part. The Houston Oilers were the team that got Billy Cannon.
Yeah,
The
and
Houston
back in
Oilers
these
had to go to
days,
court with the
yeah,
Rams.
yeah, back in these days, all the top college players, really any player that was eligible for the draft, would actually get picked by both leagues.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes,
it's
and
like Mike
actually
Ditka
that's
was drafted by the Oil. He was drafted by the Oilers and the Bears. So,
yes.
but you talk about that lawsuit a little bit in terms of how Billy Cannon's situation went down.
So Billy Cannon, because the AFL actually was not under any idea that but like Billy Cannon just looked like a free agent to them. So they went and signed him. Bud Adams signed him. He gave him, I think, like something $30,000 up front, which was, I think, 2 or 3 times as much as the Rams gave him. And because of the whole draft and secrecy thing, um, the court actually awarded Billy to sign with the team that kind of he wanted. And obviously, he went for the money, as he probably should have. So that was a massive, massive first victory for the AFL. I mean, for a new league to dupe the NFL like that, the NFL was clearly having a draft in secrecy. They knew what they were up against, I think, right away. Whether
Yeah,
they wanted to explain it or not.
it's so shady, by the way, because like what it
Oh yeah.
showed is basically like we're gonna manipulate the board to make sure that we get the players in the situations that best help the league. And that's a dangerous precedent to set because like if imagine if that happened like now. For example, like let's say instead of Chicago, being number 1, let's say Jacksonville's on the clock, right?
Hmm.
And Jacksonville doesn't have Trevor Lawrence. So they have like Caleb Williams, this generational superstar,
Mhm.
and the league's like, nah, 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 nah. Ratings were down this year. We can't have this college star go to Jacksonville. We need him to go to Chicago, or we need him to go to New York because they need a
Fine with me.
quarterback. Yeah. But a lot of people be like, whoa, 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 whoa. You can't
Yes.
do that because, like, obviously that's not number one, that's not fair. Number two, it like completely taints the image of um purity that you have in terms of competition. Um, it really it could hurt the reputation. I'm just surprised that that doesn't get brought up more because like that's shady as crap that the NFL did
Yes.
that. And now, I mean, now everything's disclosed and competition's full, so I don't think we ever have to really worry
Yeah.
about that. But you mentioned Billy Cannon though, and I just want to give him a few. I think he's number one. I think he's a Hall of Fame player. He's
Yeah.
not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's a college football Hall of Famer. He won the Heisman at LSU, and he was up until Joe Burrow. He was the only Heisman winner from LSU, but he was obviously the number one pick in the draft. Really, both drafts for a reason, and he was a complete game changer when he got to
Oh,
Houston. There was actually a game he had in 1961 against the Titans. Listen to the stat line: 216 rushing yards, 114 receiving yards on 5 receptions, 43 kick return yards,
oh my God.
5 touchdowns. So that's total 373 scrimmage yards, which was a record up until Glenn Melbourne of Denver broke it in 95, which was
Former
almost all.
Bear.
Yeah, and almost all of his were punt return yards, like at least two-thirds of it. For fantasy bros out there, that would be 68 points
Oh
in PPR points for Billy Cannon.
God.
It's the greatest offensive performance of all time by any player. Like
That's like your 99 overall doing that in Madden. Like that would be
he's
like
playing
their stat line.
it's like he's playing on rookie mode. And
Yeah.
the most impressive thing to me is like because when I saw 373 scrimmage yards, I'm like, yeah, but 100 of those are probably kick return yards. No, only 43. That means like
Yeah.
he basically returned a couple of kicks. Literally all of it was from running and receiving.
Real football.
He was unbelievable. He to me he should be in the Hall of Fame for what he did. I think he legitimized the league in its infancy, and that's what allowed the Oilers. That's what allowed the Chiefs, or I guess they were the Texans back then, the Chargers, to gain some popularity. And it
Hmm.
allowed because ultimately, if it's only 3 teams surviving, that's not good enough. Like those teams would
No.
have just folded anyway, even though they had money. Like it kept the whole league and their status legitimized, and it got people
Yeah.
watching the games on ABC, which was so big.
It
Um,
was like, yeah, like I said, it was a massive, massive victory that they pulled that out
he
because
should be, yeah, he should be in the Hall of Fame just for
he
what he
really
did for the
should.
AFL. Yeah,
Yeah. Um, and then the rest of the draft, the 1968, the NFL draft was weird that year. The AFL draft was kind of weird too. Uh, Nobody knows the order, but they do know this. The
that's
names are
shady.
drawn.
That's pretty shady.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's all. Yeah, I'm sure. Like I'm sure it's interesting that Bud Adams, one of the two biggest owners of the league, gave away with Billy Cannon. But
yeah.
we do know this: the names were drawn from a box. So when we start getting into draft season, it's combine week right now, and you see like these draft rooms, these war rooms in a couple months, and they have names everywhere and computers that go from the floor to the ceiling, and they're all touchscreen. Just think the AFL started because they were like Mike Smith to the Raiders. That's
Lamar
how
Lamar Hunt literally pulled out like one of his wife's shoe boxes
yeah.
and said, "Okay, here we'll put all the players' names in here, and then we'll decide the future of pro football
It
with this."
reminds me when we at my family parties in the summer, when we have like a bags tournament, and we literally like will write each other's names on pieces of paper, and somebody takes a hat and like somebody pulls out the name, like, oh, Brian and Neil, you guys are partners today or whatever. There
Yeah,
were a couple Hall of Famers that were taken in the draft. Jim Otto, who was a legendary center for the Raiders. He,
stud.
when you think about it, he went through some bad years. So that's I always think that's cool when a guy can live beyond those bad years on a team.
His rookie card's really funny just because like the Raiders weren't the silver and black yet; they were the black and gold.
Black,
But
yeah,
yeah,
it
they have
doesn't
him
look
and like
right.
Tom Flores was their quarterback. It's just like it's bizarre to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Johnny Robinson, who was the defensive back for Dallas and then eventually Kansas City. Ron Mix, who is an unbelievably great offensive lineman for the Chargers, but he was actually drafted by Boston. And then we were saying that players are drafted by both leagues. Cardinals legend Larry Wilson was drafted by Buffalo. Um, but
yeah.
anyways, in the early summer, around June, the AFL signed a 5-year deal with ABC. So they had a broadcasting right. This was another huge step for them. And actually, ABC brought a new lens for how people viewed professional football. They would a lot of times they wanted to make the players more personalized. So they would bring the cameras on the sideline. They would show the guys on the bench. They'd get close and personal. Like, you could see the sweat. You could see the 5 o'clock shadow on the guys. That was
Yeah.
things the NFL didn't do. But this was their way of bringing, you know, the game into your living room closer to you.
Can you
They also
imagine?
had, go ahead.
Can you imagine Lamar Hunt if he were alive today and he could see Scott Hansen hosting NFL Red Zone?
Oh, I
And
know.
like the viewing experience now compared like the fact that supers and lower thirds, just any type of graphic to showcase what's going
Yes.
on in a game and what
That
player did what, the fact that that was like revolutionary
I didn't
is
know that was
crazy
what
to
that was called.
yeah,
Supers.
supers, yeah, that's what the supers, or I like to just say lower thirds, and I work in
Okay.
TV and I say lower thirds, but to me, like the fact that those were revolutionary concepts
Yeah, you
and
don't think about them.
like I have trouble. We were watching the 1981 NFC title game. Like it's hard to watch a game without a score bug, and
Exactly.
the score bug was really more mid 90s. Like
Yeah.
watching
94.
football, yeah, and like it was just a completely. It's amazing how far the game has gone. And like I watched a
Truly.
lot of. And you go back and watch AFL highlights, like the early 60s, it's not the same. Like even NFL films was like Steve and Ed Sable don't really do their thing until like what 61, 62.
62, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so watching like the 1960 AFC or AFL championship game
It's not
is
easy.
it's like watching something from the 40s. Like
Yeah.
you're it's like
It's like watching Civil War footage.
yeah, you're like you're watching Babe Ruth swing a bat. Like it's not that much different. And it's all black and white. Like putting together shorts for this podcast is going to be tough, just because like finding Billy Cannon highlights is going to be like a daunting
Yeah.
task, and
He's that
that's okay.
blur right there.
Yeah, I'll probably just tell people like that was definitely the game that I'm referring to. They won't know a difference, but like,
Yeah, no.
but like but it's amazing how far the league has gone, and really television and sports in general. That
Yeah.
I mean, I can watch 4 games at one time. I can get
Hmm.
stats on my phone within seconds.
Hmm.
And you're but the AFL kind of started that because the NFL was stubborn as hell. Like
Yeah.
where they were like somebody like George Hallis would have been like, "No, we don't want to put boom mics on the field. Like,
Yeah.
like, we don't want that the dang
What's a boom mic?
yeah, that's what the boomers want." Like, because back then boomers were probably like the young generation. Like,
Yeah, right.
well,
Those are what the
not really.
kids
They were,
want.
yeah, not even really, because they were what they're. I guess they were the boomers. I guess were late 40s. So these guys, they were the
Yeah,
kids at
the
that point. They
kids.
were
Yeah.
teenage.
Damn
Yeah.
kids. The first
Yep.
game of the AFL was played on a Friday night. And I thought that was kind of interesting because this year the NFL is going to have a Friday night. It's not the opener, but it's the
Yeah.
opening weekend.
Yeah, but I don't
Um,
think the antitrust rules are. I don't think they matter because I think the game is
it's in
played in
Brazil.
Brazil. So that's the NFL's trying to get around that now. So
Holy God.
yeah,
Um, Played September 9th, 1960. The Denver Broncos, I wrote New England Patriots. It's the Boston Patriots. 13-10 final score. Broncos were winners. Al Carmichael of Denver, who's in the Packers Hall of Fame,
yes,
scored the league's first touchdown.
he was probably the only, like, one of the few highlights of the Packers in the 1950s.
Really?
And yeah, because that was like Denver was really the end of his career. Like
Yeah.
when he went to the AFL. And that's where, like, and that's what was cool about a new league is that these older players that, you know, were at the end or and a lot of times, like in George Blanda's case, needed a fresh start. Or Len
Yeah.
Dawson's case needed a fresh
Right.
start.
Who we talk
They
about later.
Yeah, so they needed to, it opened up more opportunities. But yeah, uh Carmichael, he had most of his success in Green Bay for his career, but like I said, he was probably the only highlight of the 50s. We've talked about the Packers in a previous episode, the Lombardi Packers. The 50s version of that team was bad. Um, but yeah, and then you talk about Gino Cappelletti yet?
No, I haven't mentioned him. Gino Cappelletti, Patriots legend. He actually had the first points on a field goal. The first points of the league's history, I should say,
Yeah.
on a field goal.
And did you know
Um,
that he's one of the three players in history to lead the league in scoring five different times?
really?
Yeah,
No kidding.
and Steven Gostkowski,
Another
and
Patriot.
yep, Gino Cappelletti, which he led the AFL. So yeah,
Yeah. Pounce.
who's the other one?
Um, I don't know.
Don Hudson.
Ah, Jesus. He always
Right.
set that up. Do
Well,
you know
I
who?
mean, I'll do a video on Don Hudson, but I'm just gonna say it right now: top five player all time.
Oh, yeah, I'd
Like,
say so.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Don, he did everything. I know the episode's not about him, but that shows you how good Gino Cappelletti was because he was not just an offensive. He played defense too, but he was a kicker. Like he was
Yeah,
Mr. Utility, and he was Mr. Patriot for a long time. Like
he was
yeah, like the
before John Hanna.
yeah, and even when John Hanna like was dominating the league, like and after he retired, like Gino Cappelletti would like broadcast Patriot games.
Yes,
Like the fans loved him. He was like one of the faces of the franchise up
he
until the Brady
was.
era.
Do you know who his son-in-law is?
I don't.
Tom Waddle.
Oh, really? In
Yeah.
Chicago? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. He married Gino's daughter.
Huh.
So
That's crazy.
yeah, I know. Great bloodline. Actually, all like Tom had like five daughters and four of them played like college sports. So like I mean, great
It,
bloodline.
hey, when is the son due for the draft?
Yeah.
Need to get him on the Bears.
That would be a perfect guy for the Bears.
Yeah.
Attendance was not wildly successful for the new league.
No
Teams
kidding.
averaged just over 16,000 fans per game, while the NFL was at about 40,000. Dallas and Houston, not surprising, were the only ones that averaged over 20,000. And I think they were like just at 20,000.
And here's another, like, I don't want to pick on George Hallis, but short-sighted version of George Hallis, I gotta come back and just burn you again. Two different teams drew really well in Dallas, because the Cowboys drew fans and the Texans drew fans. Just imagine if you had one team,
One team. Yeah.
they would have because you wouldn't have had to
Everybody
split
went
the
there.
city in half. Everybody would have
Lamar
been
Hunt
yeah,
used to do because the Cowboys used to play on Friday nights a lot, and Lamar Hunt used to do a kind of a promotion for fans that they would get free admission on Sunday to the Texans games if
yeah.
they brought their ticket stub from a high school football game. on
Yeah.
Friday night.
Oh, they were promotional geniuses, and you had to
Oh,
be in the
they were.
AFL. Like
They
you
were.
couldn't just like the NFL, the Cowboys plan was like, hey, we got the Cowboy or we got the Bears
We,
coming, we got the Packers coming, we got, the Giants are coming to town. Like they didn't have the AFL can't be like, hey, we got the Raiders coming to town. Like
the
that wasn't a
Boston
draw.
Patriots.
Yeah, no one cares about those teams. So they had so much going on promotionally, and the whole league did that. Like,
Yeah,
we'll talk about the Jets a little, in the next episode when they become the Jets. But
right.
I think my favorite cheerleader name I've ever heard. I don't know the current Houston Texans cheerleaders, but the Texans. Oh
Oh,
my God,
that was funny. Yeah.
that was awesome. I
I
was
know. I
just
was
like
like,
that.
oh,
What
I
a
get it.
that's that like chef's kiss right there. Like, but they were promotional geniuses, and you had to be to get fans into the stands at an AFL game because in the
Oh, yeah.
first couple of seasons, the football and most of the league wasn't really great.
No. Um, that year, 1960, the player and rookie of the year was Abner Hayes, of the Dallas Texans. He was from North Texas State and HBCU. We'll talk about HBCUs probably more in the next episode, and how big of a role they played in the AFL. He
Yeah.
averaged 6.9 yards a touch, and he had 12 total touchdowns. Pretty damn good for a rookie.
Do you think he has a case for the Hall of Fame?
I think a lot of these guys do. I really
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. 3-time All AFL, which
Yeah.
there are only, what, 9, 10 seasons of the AFL?
Yeah.
And to me, I want to highlight the importance of the early stars in this league. Like the players that were stars in the early 60s kept the league alive. And I think that means a lot.
Oh,
Um,
certainly.
and but yeah, I think like that he should be in the senior category. If I didn't look and see if he was like one of the the
Ever.
finalists.
Yeah, but
Uh,
he deserves it.
yeah, they ought to look into that.
Um, the difference in play style from the NFL was clear from the start. AFL teams averaged to pass 7 more times a game than NFL teams, and they were only running it 2 times less than the NFL counterparts. So that technically tells you that they had faster pace, but fast football isn't always good football, as we might know.
No,
NFL averaged more yards per play, not by a huge stretch, but it got bigger over the first couple of years. And they had less turnovers per game. So, but also kind of a weird thing, their sack numbers for the AFL. We don't have that for the NFL until I think like 67 or something like that.
the NFL
Um,
is like so frustrating
they're
in terms
so
of like
goddamn behind.
yeah, well, like the 2 point conversion, college football adopts that
Yes.
in like 58. It's like 94 before the NFL adopts it. You have, like you mentioned, this just recording sacks, not that hard. The
No.
AFL was doing it, and then
Like,
it
and
took
they
the
called
NFL
it a
until
sack. It wasn't like they
yeah,
were like, "Oh my god, the defensive end tackled the quarterback? Is that
yeah, and then
legal?"
yeah, and then players like people don't even think Deacon Jones, like they kind of forget about him, like players like
Yeah.
that played in the 60s that were such great pass rushers,
Oh,
and
his sack when Pro Football Reference finally released those,
yeah,
he had like 3 of the top 10 sack seasons of all time.
yeah,
It was
and
like unbelievable.
yeah, they were so far behind in the way they look at it, but the quality of the football, the NFL still so much better than the AFL. And it really, to me, it came down to the quarterbacks because outside of like, Jack Kemp, Len Dawson, George Blanda, like outside of those three, AFL quarterbacks were not very good.
No.
Um, and you could see it in kind of the efficiency numbers, but
Yeah.
The NFL had better quarterbacks because
Yeah, they did.
you had Unitas, you had Star,
Wyatt
uh,
Tittle,
Wyatt Tittle.
although he
There
was
were
at the end of his rope. Sonny
yeah,
Jurgensen.
sure, young Sonny Jurgensen in the early '60s. Like
Mhm.
those were the QBs, and because you don't get Namath until like the mid '60s
Right.
in the AFL, and that changes the conversation.
It's
But
definitely.
uh, people that say like the AFL is just as good as the NFL, that is true once you get to the late '60s.
Yes.
In
Right
the
now.
early in the early 60s, it's not. No, the NFL was a much better league. So
Definitely.
people like Lombardi, people like Hallis that said that they were correct.
They
Uh,
were.
but however, I will say the AFL was more fun because they did pass more. They did revolutionary things like we just talked about with the broadcasting, the way they demonstrated the game for TV. They had more fun uniforms. They were kind
Yeah.
of football for the
Well,
younger
they
crowd.
had different uniforms.
Yeah, yeah. The Broncos were awful.
Yeah.
Those yeah, what is it, yellow and brown?
Yeah, mustard
Yeah,
and shit
yeah.
brown.
I don't know who came up with that,
Oh
but
God. Uh
speaking of Denver, but like they had fun things going on for them. So Denver at the end of the '60s season, they have the uniform burning ceremony, which is just amazing. And it's like
yeah.
right after the game, by the way. So you have a bunch of fans start a giant fire.
It's like disco
Like,
demolition.
yes, that's freaking awesome. Like if the White Sox were a football team, they're definitely in the
They would
AFL.
have done that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, they
It,
would have been.
and
Well, actually, Bill Veck, who was he wasn't, but he was a friend of Lamar Hunt. Bill Veck, who had so many great and funny promotions through the years, eventually became the owner of the White Sox.
oh wow, there you
So
go.
there you go.
He
Yeah.
he was probably more fun than Jerry Reinsdorf. But
Oh yes, as he's been in the news a lot lately here in Chicago.
but my favorite AFL moment of all time when it came to just like Twitter, if this happened like on X now, it would be the most insane moment ever. Is when a Patriots fan at the end of a game against the Texans in Boston, he runs onto the field, and all the fans think that time's out, and the game's over, time ran out. But the referees say no, one more play, and the referees are wearing the orange uniforms, right?
Mhm.
And no, so the crowd like gets, they get off the field and they're all standing right up on the sideline. I'm like, it's like we're watching the and one mixtape. Eh,
From like 2003.
yeah, like the professor. And this Patriots fan, like they snapped the ball. I guess Len Dawson was the one throwing. I can't remember, but like he throws the pass and the fan deflects it away, and they call it
It,
incomplete.
it was
They
playing
say,
linebacker.
yeah, a guy and like the one of the players
A
on the
tan
Chiefs,
suit.
one of the players on the Texans goes up to Hank Stram after the game, like, Coach, you won't believe it, but a guy in some khakis ran onto the field and he knocked the ball down. So, and I think Hank Stram even said, like, it'd be nice to get somebody. We haven't seen defense like that in the AFL all year. Like, so,
See
like
that? Yeah. You
if
couldn't
I
make that
wanted
up.
like if you and your buddies like wanted to go out, have a couple of beers, like and get kind of Mac championship type vibes,
Yeah.
early 60s AFL would have been for
Oh
you.
yeah.
And
Absolutely.
it gets much better as the decade goes on. It becomes a really legitimate football league because of the money they're willing to spend. But those early days were kind of rough.
Oh yeah. So Houston ended up winning the first AFL championship in 1960. As we said earlier, they played their games at a high school. Um, Bud Adams was a really smart guy. He knew that the league would be deficient in one area right away. He knew the defensive backs would suck. So he signed George Blanda, who had been with the Bears, but he had retired for a year to head his offense. The passing game that they had was far and away better than everyone else's in the league. Now, you can't compare it to what there are nowadays. So don't go back and be like, well, actually, he threw 22 interceptions. Shut the hell up. Only Johnny Unitas in the NFL threw more touchdowns than George Blanda. So that's pretty damn good.
It was still
Their,
the dead ball era. Yes.
yes. Their opponent for their first ever AFL title game had given Houston one of their 4 losses on the season. Houston went into the game 10-4. The Chargers were the team that they played, and they had beaten Houston 24-21 7 weeks prior. The Chargers were a formidable opponent. They had scored, this is wild, 184 points over their final 4 games. They scored 46 points a game.
Pretty
And
good.
a lot of that is because their head coach was the legendary Sid Gilman. And he had a pretty good staff under him. He had Al Davis, and then he had Chuck Noll, who was the defensive line coach. The Chargers were prone to being boom or bust. They had 3 games where they scored 3 or less points. So the
That's
last four
amazing that
games, they
that's
averaged
amazing.
46.
How are you that like hot or cold? And
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't understand that fact. It's like how can you have 184 points in 4 games, but then have 3 games where you score three or less? Like that's one of
Yeah.
those feats that you won't ever see again. But these are the two teams I'm confident, and really the Oilers. But these are the two teams that are in the early 60s are the teams that could compete in the NFL. Like
Oh,
they
yeah,
wouldn't win the
definitely.
NFL. They would not beat the Packers. They would
But
not
they
have beaten
they wouldn't
the
go
Eagles.
winless.
Yeah, because the Eagles won they won the championship in 60, but
Yes.
they they wouldn't go winless. They would probably be middle of the pack. And you specifically mentioned Gilman. Like he was ahead of his time. He was the first to study film, which at the time no one else did. And he was
Hmm.
kind of the first to start doing that. He was the first to hire a strength coach, which, now is common practice. The strength coaches all have like staffs under them now. Uh, he was basically the father of the modern forward pass. You watch all these 80s teams with Al Davis, basically picking all the players. He got a lot of his football knowledge from Sid Gilman. Um,
Yeah.
and fun fact, and Belichick actually mentions this in Full Color Football, is he lost the head coaching job. Like he was the finalist. It was one of the finalists for the head coaching job at Ohio State. Who beat him out?
At Ohio State, it would have been Woody Hayes, right?
Yeah, that's crazy. Like to
Oh,
me,
yeah.
is you go from 3 yards in a cloud of dust, which is Woody Hayes and what he's known for. Like we're gonna run it up the middle every play versus
Yeah.
Sid Gilman was revolutionizing football. Like I couldn't think of two more contrasting candidates, but and Woody Hayes and Sid Gilman, and both of them won a ton. Like Woody Hayes won a
Yes.
ton, so I'm not bashing Woody Hayes or anything, but it's amazing the difference between the two. But that Chargers team it was fun. Jack Kemp was dealing. He actually won first team all AFL
Hmm.
over players like Blanda, over players like Dawson, who are Hall of Famers. Um, and Kemp actually later becomes a Republican congressman who was very influential during the 1980s and did a lot of like fiscal policy with Ronald
Oh,
Reagan.
that didn't work out.
Yeah, but no, in the 80s, it was a good time to be a
It was,
Republican.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, yes, but the theory wasn't
yeah.
backed up.
Well, it depends on who
It
you
was,
ask.
yeah, it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
But
Uh,
anyways, um, Sid Gilman and Frank Leahy, who was the GM for the Chargers, they were going up against Lou Rimkus, who was the head coach of the Houston Oilers. And there's kind of an angle with that because Lou Rimkus had actually worked for Sid Gilman with the Rams just a couple years prior to that because that's where Gilman was before he took the job with the Chargers. And Frank Leahy was a coach of Lou Rimkus at Notre Dame. So both of them knew that. So that would be, if we're talking about like a Super Bowl or something like that, that would be a massive storyline going into it. The Oilers were 6.5 point favorites, despite the Chargers winning the more recent um, game between them meeting. There was 32,000 fans in attendance. It was held in Houston. There was a rotation of AFL versus, or excuse me, Eastern Division versus Western Division. Um, and that year it just happened to be an Eastern Division. So Houston was the one who held the title game.
yep.
Blanda had a magical day. He threw 3 touchdowns, and he kicked a field goal. He threw for over 300 yards. And actually, if you watch like the film, he was throwing a couple seeds out there. Like he had a really good game, but he did not win MVP. That went to rookie Billy Cannon. And actually, Billy Cannon, he scored on a wheel route, and I don't know why I thought about this, but it reminded me of the Drew Brees to Reggie Bush wheel route touchdown in the 2006 NFC Championship. And I think it was like the same amount of yards too. I think it was like an
Maybe
88 yarder.
maybe Sean Payton was watching some Sid Gilman tape.
He might have.
Or
The
not Sid
first
Gilman.
season,
It was, yeah, because
Lou
this was the
Rimkus.
Oilers. Lou
Yeah.
Rimkus, excuse me. But that was actually a really fun game. Like the AFL first season, absolutely like
Oh, massive success.
success versus expectations, absolutely.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
we go to 61 and it's kind of all systems go because
Yeah,
all
everybody was retained. There was no, they didn't have, unfortunately, they didn't have like the burst um that they might have been hoping for to gain more fans. Really, the only thing that changed in the AFL that year in the offseason was the Chargers moving to San Diego from LA, only to move back a few years ago. Um, a couple big names were drafted in the AFL draft that year. Mike Ditka was drafted by Houston. Bob Lilly was drafted by Dallas, the Texans. Herb Adderley was drafted by the New York Titans, and Fran Tarkenton was drafted by the Boston Patriots, and none of them played for the
I
AFL.
I think Bob Lilly may be the greatest draft pick to never play for the league.
Bob
He was
Lilly,
drafted.
the only guy like we talked about during our Hall of Fame episode, the Hall of Fame meter that Pro Football Reference has, the only guy that's going to ever catch Bob Lilly on that is Aaron Donald. That's how dominant Bob Lilly was.
Bob Lilly is arguably top three defensive player of all time, I would
Mm-hmm.
say. And what makes it sting worse is he's drafted by the Dallas Texans or the Kansas City Chiefs in
Yeah,
modern tongue, and it makes it sting worse that he gets drafted by the Cowboys. So like
yeah,
he didn't
and that's
even
where
leave
he's
town.
known. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a legendary cowboy. I would argue he's probably the best cowboy of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And he could have been a Texan, but he did not. He went to the Cowboys and did what
Mm-hmm.
he did, and that had to stink for Lamar Hunt for sure.
Oh God, yeah.
But the Texans, they cleaned up.
The Dallas Texans, they weren't like they were finishing above 500, but they weren't, competing for championships in the first 2 years, but they were building something. They had an incredible draft class. Jim Tyre, who was an offensive tackle. Please go back and look at his resume. This is a man that needs to be in the Hall of Fame. He made 6 all-pro teams. I don't know how he's not in the Hall of Fame. Jerry Mays, who's the defensive end, and EJ Holub, or Holub, it might be, who was a linebacker. These are all guys that were a part of a few AFL championship teams and 2 teams that made the Super Bowl.
Yeah,
This was, they were putting something together. They were a young team, but it really started to go well for them.
yeah, and I think that kind of built, like you said, it kind of built the foundation of the Super Bowl one and the Super Bowl four teams.
Yeah.
Uh, and Kansas City, or I guess when they became Kansas City, they were still trying to chase Houston. They were still trying to chase, the early Chargers success. Yeah,
Yes.
Dallas, they did end up winning a championship in '63, but um, it was '63 or
62.
'62. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then they moved to Kansas City in '63, but they were still trying to find that dominance because they had a lot of resources. So honestly, they should have been one of the top teams. And this draft class kind of helps cement their run all the way into the early '70s. Um, but that was a really good draft class for them.
Attendance picked up a little bit, only about 1,000 people. So they went from 16,000 to 17,000 people. The NFL matched the AFL's 14-game season. So, like we said, the NFL was watching. They were keeping tabs on this league. And that actually stayed that way until 1978 when they went to the 16-game season. And then that was true until only, 2 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
Houston and San Diego were at over 27,000 people, though. So the average was around 17,000, but that was getting brought down by some poor teams, like we mentioned earlier, the Raiders and the Titans. Buffalo's attendance might have been the most impressive, though. For a team that was under 500, they averaged nearly 20,000 fans per game.
And they laid the foundation of what Bills Mafia is now, because even back then, like their fans were probably the rowdiest in the AFL.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily breaking tables, but they were like drinking,
They
like
weren't
they
drinking out of a bowling ball.
yeah, but they were still partying in the stands. I think they
Yeah.
said they were bringing grills into the stands. Like
Oh, that's
it,
awesome.
yeah, it was like that's a vibe. Like
Oh,
early
yeah.
'60s Bills games. That sounds like a lot of fun. I don't think I could hang with Bills Mafia now. Like I'm not that hardcore. Uh, like you know
A
those
one-time
people.
thing, I think, for me, but I think
Yeah,
that would.
I could maybe do Bills Mafia in its present day form if I'm like 20, but
Yeah.
not when I'm 30 now. I ain't doing that. But yeah, and what was kind of interesting, and you wrote it in your notes here, but I want to kind of mention is even though the AFL was kind of seen as like the more explosive, pass happy, progressive league, right?
Yeah.
The NFL still averaged more yards per play.
Yeah.
The AFL had the higher pace of play, but they were passing more and running less. The NFL was the higher quality league still.
Yeah.
And I think a
The
lot of it
gap
came down.
actually grew this year.
Yeah, and you have to think too, like how much was it even it was probably even worse in the fact that like if you took away the Chargers and the Oilers, like
Yeah.
offense was probably really like it made me think like the Raiders games must have been unwatchable in
Oh,
the early
yeah.
60s.
It would have been like watching
Yeah.
the Tampa Bay Vipers from the XFL a couple years ago.
Yeah. And really like the only teams in 60 and 61, like I said earlier, that could probably hang in the NFL are the Chargers and the Oilers.
Yeah,
Um,
the Chargers moved into a newly refurbished Balboa Stadium in San Diego. They were a more complete team than 1960. The offense generated the headlines, of course, with being coached by Sid Gilman, but the defense was actually the dominant piece of the team. The heart of the defense was the original fearsome foursome, not the one in the LA Rams, the San Diego Chargers. Ron Neary, Bill Hudson, the rookie of the year, Earl Faison, who had a short but fantastic career, and Ernie Ladd, who also had a great career. Three rookies coached by, and I brought him up earlier, Chuck Noll. The Chargers started 11-0 that year and had their perfect season interrupted by Houston. The
yeah.
AFL
And
championship. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was about to say it's probably one of the great teams uh of that era that no one really remembers.
Oh yeah, certainly. And they ended up getting what they wanted in a couple years. But there was a lot of, I'm sure, turmoil after a while, especially here in 61. The AFL championship game hangover was a real thing. Um, Bud Adams and Lou Rimkus started the year on bad terms. Bud Adams sent the team to Hawaii in the middle of training camp.
That doesn't
And
sound bad, but it probably was.
yeah, it's like that might have been great like in June or something like that. But Rimkus was like, we couldn't focus on football, seeing all the palm trees and probably the women, I'm sure too.
Yeah.
um,
We're
but
having a
they
luau.
they started 1-3-1, and Lou Rimkus was shown the door. He was fired 9 months after bringing the franchise a league title. Wally Lem, who was an assistant of Rimkus, took over, and Houston took off. They rattled off 9 straight wins. Every single game, they won by 2 scores or more. And actually, only 2 of the games they won by 2 scores. The rest of them were by 3 or more.
Yeah.
They had 9 straight wins. Like I said, oh, wait, I already mentioned that part. My bad. And then They scored at least 27 points in each game. The offense was a cheat code, as the kids say. Blanda
Yeah.
ran away with the MVP. He finished with 36 passing touchdowns. No Bear has ever finished with 30 passing touchdowns ever. Like
Yeah.
George Blanda did something in 1961 a Chicago Bears never done. And actually he held like the season record. Jurgensen tied him up, I think like the next year or something, or maybe even that year.
Yeah.
But it wasn't broken until Marino in 84.
Really?
That's which is wild to think.
Yeah, I figured somebody in the 70s would like with Air Coryell or something would have figured that out. Like
Yeah,
with
you would
Dan,
think like
I
Dan
figured Dan
Fouts.
Fouts would have done it. But
Yeah.
um,
Um
but
his
I was gonna say like that backfield with Blanda and Billy Cannon was just so
wow,
explosive.
incredible.
And
Then you had
what's so
Charlie
crazy?
Hennigan and Bill Groman at wide receiver. I mean,
Yeah.
they were unstoppable.
So what's crazy about George Blanda is that he was already over a decade into his football, like professional football career. He got
Yeah.
drafted in 1949 and played basically like a decade with the Bears.
Yeah.
Um, and like the AFL was kind of like his one song, basically,
Yeah.
which it really wasn't because he ended up playing like,
It lasted like 13 more years or something.
yeah, he was like the 1960s Tom Brady, where he just played forever.
He
So
played in four different decades.
yeah, he can claim that he played in the same league as Otto Graham and Joe Ferguson, who was like a starting quarterback for the Bills. Ferguson was a longtime 70s and 80s quarterback who finished his career in the 1990s. So he can basically say that his career basically overlaps with somebody that played with like Jeff George and somebody's
Yeah.
that overlapped with Otto Graham. Like that's how far,
I
like
always think
literally
that's cool. I
half,
love those things.
yeah, like half of NFL. I just basically like took 1949 to 1950.
Half
That was
the
that
NFL.
was almost half the NFL's existence. George Blanda has kind of touched. Um, so
I always
that's
think
what's
it's
crazy.
cool that like Aaron Rodgers and Jim McMahon. Now people be like, well, what's so big about them?
Oh yeah, they were
They
teammates with Brett Favre.
they both backed up Brett Favre. So you
Yeah, I
had a
mean,
guy that was drafted in 1982 and a
yeah,
guy that's still playing today.
yeah. Well, I mean, you could Aaron Rodgers and Steve McMichael are also, I guess,
Yeah,
teammate cousins.
teammates. Yeah, teammate cousins. Yeah, teammate
Yeah,
Eskimo brothers.
yeah, yeah. We're like, he, yeah, I love doing those games like because
Yeah.
with players that play forever, like Tom Brady played with Doug Flutie.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, like Doug Flutie played in the god dang USFL.
Yeah.
Like,
I
and then
mean,
Tom Brady was teammates with guys that are in their third year in the league right now. So
yeah.
it's crazy. But go on to the title game of
So
that.
there wasn't a lot to talk about. It was a pretty boring title game. Houston was clearly peaking at the time going in. Sid Gilman was still very confident. He projected that they were going to win. Christmas Eve, it was not a sellout. It was in Balboa Stadium. Really sloppy game. Blanda and Cannon were the difference in the end, although Blanda not so much. Cannon ended up being the guy that won it again for Houston. The game is actually more remembered for a heated exchange between Sid Gilman and the officials after the game. And Chuck Zeman, who played for the Chargers, apparently wrestled a referee to the ground because he was, quote, roughing up Coach Gilman. I don't know whether to believe him or not, but like a referee roughing up a coach is crazy. And then the player going after the referee physically. Could you imagine
That's
that nowadays?
Yeah, well, and like I said, the AFL brought entertainment value because just
Travis
like with
Kelsey would do that.
yeah, oh gosh, but like it's Taylor Swift told him to do it, but it's one of those that's just another entertainment value that the AFL had because you had like fans nearly intercepting passes.
Yeah.
You had them playing in high
roused on
school
the field.
Balboa Stadium, like it was, it seated 30,000 state people at the time, but now it's a high school stadium. Like you have all of it's still almost amateur hour, but you had great players mixed in. Like Billy Cannon's an all-time player, but he played in like a league that was just so rough on its edges.
Yes.
And it's kind of funny to watch, and but it's a league in its infancy. The NFL went through
Mhm.
the same thing. It's kind of impressive the AFL got cleaned up as quickly as it did, because
Yeah, they certainly did.
The NFL had teams folding after like 2 games in the 20s. Like you, it's honestly it's remarkable that it advanced as fast as it did. But you get to the 1962 season, and like you said, all of those teams are retained again.
That they're brought back. And we brought up earlier, the only teams that are struggling are the Raiders and the Titans, who both thankfully got saved. Attendance. Now, this is kind of the crazy thing because 61, like I said, there was nothing crazy that happened going into the 61 season. Nothing wild. It was kind of a boring year. Well, I guess maybe watching Houston's offense wasn't boring, but the championship game wasn't good. But 62, like something happened that like the fans just started coming out. Attendance goes up to over 20,000 per team. Now, that's a 20% increase, but that's being brought down by the Jets and the Raiders, who were, averaging 4 or 5,000 fans a game. So every team is above 20,000 fans right now, besides those two. In the 62 draft, not a wildly successful draft in terms of, big names. John Haddle, who had a good career with San Diego, him and Lance Allworth, of course, were famous. Mike Stratton was a Buffalo linebacker. Tom Sestic, Buffalo defensive tackle. And Nick Bonicani, who was a part of the no-name defense in Miami. But
Yeah.
he was drafted by Boston at the time because Miami didn't exist.
Yep. Next episode.
Yes. Cookie Gilchrist, a well-known
Oh,
name in NFL history. He was a deserving MVP. He averaged 5.1 yards a carry, 15 total touchdowns, and he was a rookie, but he somehow didn't win Rookie of the Year. I don't know why.
I think their racism probably played a little bit of a factor.
Yeah,
And
certainly.
that's one thing that like a lot of black players found opportunity in the AFL because unfortunately they weren't getting the same opportunities in the NFL. There was almost like an unwritten rule where they weren't granted the same opportunity to play certain positions, or there had to be a quota on how many white players there were versus black. Nothing
Yeah.
set in stone, and some teams were more progressive. Like I think if it were up to George Halas and Vince Lombardi, I think they just wanted to put as many good players on the field as
Yeah.
they could because all they cared about was winning. But like George
Yes.
Preston Marshall, like didn't want any black players.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but going to Cookie Gilchrist, like he should have been in the NFL. He was that good, but he's on the Bills, and you go back and watch Cookie Gilchrist, unbelievably violent runner.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And
oh,
back in
oh.
and back in those days, they were tackling. It was like watching Marshawn Lynch, but with a little bit more high end speed. So just think about that for a second. Like
Oh.
Marshawn was impossible to tackle. It usually took like 2 or 3 guys to bring him down. But Marshawn didn't necessarily have like the jets to get away from like safeties and corners. This guy did. It was a fun highlight tape to watch. Probably my favorite of the 1960s of any player.
No kidding. All right. Well, I'll have to check him out, actually.
Yeah, he's
Um,
awesome.
the AFL finally eclipses over 5 yards per play. They're starting to catch up to the NFL in that regard, so they're getting a little bit more explosive. But the NFL is actually starting to pick up the passing attempts per game, so that it's there's only less than 4 attempts in the game in the difference now.
It
Of
still
course,
comes down to the quarterbacks.
the quarterbacks certainly.
Yeah.
Houston once again topped the Eastern Division, but not with the same dominance they had done the previous 2 years. They started the year with another new head coach. Um, and offensively, the Oilers still moved the ball and scored points, but they had like 48 turnovers. They they turned over the ball like it was their religion. It was brutal. I don't know how they ended up winning as many games as they did because they like it seems like if they weren't
It was
scoring a
a
touchdown, they were turning the ball over.
it's still a sloppy league though. So
Yes.
other teams are probably turning it over at the same
Doing
rate
it
that
the
they are.
same. Yeah. And when the other team isn't turning the ball over, they're probably punting. So that's how Houston was winning. And then we talked earlier, and I think this is really cool how this is where the episode is going to come down to. Dallas had been knocking on the door of contention for a couple years. They got to the NFL, excuse me, they got to the title game behind an NFL style attack. They had Abner Hayes and McClinton, um, as he was a rookie, in the backfield, and both of them carried the load. But they had a journeyman quarterback, Len Dawson, who joined Dallas that year. He was overlooked and twice cut in the NFL. He was cut by Pittsburgh, who was awful. He was cut for Bobby Lane in Pittsburgh, and then he was
Yeah.
cut in Cleveland. Um, and actually, I remember him saying that he was in the locker room with Paul Brown one time, and Paul Brown said, "There's a new league starting. I wouldn't worry about it. They're not going to last." And where does Len Dawson end up? In that league. Len Dawson showed the NFL why he should have stayed. He led the AFL in touchdown passes and yards per attempt in 1962. He was the perfect underdog for the situation. The Texans looked like they were going to fulfill their Cinderella story in the championship game. At halftime, they were up 17-0. They used their ground control offense during a rainy afternoon and occasional but effective passes from Dawson to put them up by 3 scores at the break. But the championship DNA comes out of Houston in the second half. Blanda puts the team on his back. He ties it at 17 on Charlie Toller touchdown, and we go to overtime. The teams traded possessions, a few possessions in the first overtime. I did say the first overtime. And Blanda went to work late in that overtime period. Houston was moving the ball down the field. I think they had the ball on the 35-yard line until Bill Hall, a Kansas City linebacker, picks off Blanda and runs the ball back to around midfield. At the start
Yeah.
of the second overtime, Len Dawson moves the chains on a toss to Jack Spikes, and then Spikes breaks a big run to put Dallas well into field goal range. Tommy Brooker comes out in the field on the left hash to nail a 25-yard game winner to give Dallas and Lamar Hunt in the cornerstone rivalry that he wanted to build this league around their first title.
Thank you for tuning in to the Old Souls Football Podcast. Next week, Neil and I break down Super Bowl 13 with a special guest.